All right, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about some foundational things, but we're going to get into some more, slightly more advanced topics, but by simply rehashing some stuff that we've already talked about and building upon that foundation. So first, we already talked about language, and I didn't mention that there are certain languages that resonate with people that kind of transcend words and codes and that stuff, and that language is the language of myth, metaphor, symbols, and symbology. And this is a language that is, to a strong degree, has been ripped out of our lexicon, and our culture doesn't put much faith upon these things: myth, symbols, simile, metaphor, personification, for a number of reasons that we're not going to get into in this video. I just want you to understand that there is something about these stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, and that there's deep, deep meaning that we can glean in if we're able to speak the language of symbolism, if we're able to speak the language of myth and story and simile and metaphor. And remember, all of this is about how to be successful. So one of the best ways to learn how to be successful is to study the things that have survived the test of time. And one of these things that has not only survived the test of time, but has proliferated, progressed, and often becomes the quintessential thing that is most protected in a society, is these stories of myth, is the myth behind a culture, something that embodies a group of people and gives them something to aspire to. And, this is exemplified in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, where he talks about the hero's journey and how it's a metaphysical, symbolic representation of going into the deep, foreboding unknown of the human mind and psychology, and then finding out what's going on in there, and then bringing that ultimate boon, that information that's held deep within the psyche of most people, and pulling that up back to the conscious realm and sharing it with everybody else in the tribe. And that's what a hero does metaphysically, symbolically. And ultimately, that's one of the greatest weaknesses with all languages, is what happens when everyone just forgets how to speak the language. What happens if we forget how to speak the language of myth? Does that mean that myth goes away? No, because myths are stories, and humans love to be entertained, and these stories, for some reason, entertain us. There's some particular things that we just like to hear about time and time again. And we don't care if the story is rehashed. We don't care if the story's already been told. Just give us an updated version of the same story and we will enjoy it. There's something important there. Because what people find entertaining, what people pay attention to, what people care about, is what they do spending their time all day on. And so if they're spending a huge amount of time reading stories, watching movies, enjoying culture, the culture of the day, videos, then there's something there that's worth studying. And one of these things is myth. And we're going to talk a lot about this stuff, but I want to focus this stuff in terms of something that could help us better understand consciousness, and particularly the three aspects of consciousness that I'm going to be talking about a lot, and that's thought, emotion, and action. And we can do this very easily because this trinity exists in a lot of myth, in a lot of culture, in a lot of religion throughout the world. And you see it in Egypt with Osiris, Isis, and Horus. You see it in Judeo-Christianity with Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And you see it in Hinduism with Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So these deities, they're nothing more than just a symbolical, metaphorical representation of the three aspects of human consciousness, which are our thoughts, emotions, and actions. These gods were never meant to be externalized. They could be externalized and still work within the lexicon, simply because as above, so below, as within, so without. So if something's occurring on the outside, you should represent it as it's also occurring within you as well. And I'm not going to belabor this point. All that I'm doing is telling you how I'm going to be using gods, how I'm going to be using metaphor, how I'm going to be using myth. I don't care whether it's true or not, or whether they created this story on purpose. I'm using what has worked in the past and updating it and explaining it and utilizing it potentially for what it was used for, what its true original intentions were, how it was able to sweep across Rome, how this information became so prized as a possession for cultures, for the survival and success of cultures. And so, but ultimately, I don't care how they were used or if they were used to show this stuff, because that doesn't matter. All that matters is that this is another way of thinking about the exact same things that I'm going to be talking about, and that ultimately makes them more interesting. Because as you can tell, a lot of the stuff that I talk about is empirical. It's just conversation. There's nothing entertaining about it. For a lot of you, I'm sure that you're struggling to even listen, pay attention. It's like, well, what if I took all of this stuff and we talked about gods fighting in space and they're having these great battles, competing against each other and doing all this great stuff, and then there's this Jesus guy and he's awesome, but then he's just perfect and everyone hates him because he's so perfect. I mean, people can relate to that. So then they crucify him, and then it's all about relations and getting you to listen to the story, and then you absorb the information much more effectively. And like I said, we'll be talking about myth a lot. We'll be talking about a lot of different symbols in later videos. I just want to use this opportunity to talk about the three aspects of consciousness, just because, we got to understand this stuff if we're going to be able to move forward. So first comes thought, okay? I want to remind you, we've talked about this before. We talked about the mind being all, but we really haven't really talked about thought in general. We really haven't focused on it that much. We've talked a lot about emotion, meaning, purpose, and intention, but we really haven't thought about thought, because I wanted to put that on the back burner first. So we're just going to talk about it a little bit more here and then move on to emotion. So in Judeo-Christianity, you have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the Father is what thought is, okay? It's the same thing with Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Osiris is the father in that creation story. So understand, sorry, I forgot to mention this, in the Trinity story with these three gods, all three of these stories are creation stories, how our universe is created. And that's just a metaphorical representation of how humans create. In order for humans to create, in order for us to be successful, we have to create. There's a process by which that occurs, and it's a threefold process that we've talked about many, many times. Talk about it again here. You have to have the thought. You have to have a thought to create something, and then you need the intention and the motivation, the emotion to create that thing in the real world. And then to actually create is taking action in the real world. And that is a number one trait to be successful, is to create things in the real world and then distribute them, sell them. That's the essence of capitalism. In order for that to work, you have to be able to create. You have to know this system, this process. You don't have to just create widgets or anything to sell. You can create poetry, you can create raps, stories, songs, movies. All of this stuff is going to make you hyper successful. Creation makes you hyper successful. This is the process by which creation is made. And we have these stories that allow us to get into deeper meaning of these stories. And I'm just here to explain the language of them. So getting back to thought, okay? So remember, everything that you perceive is a manifestation or a construct of the mind, in that you don't perceive true objective reality. You experience data structures, and those data structures are essentially meaningless to you until meaning is imbued upon them by you or by somebody telling you about these things. Okay, so, but ultimately what is occurring is that your thoughts direct your consciousness. And then it's important, and we're going to talk about this before we get into anything deeper about thoughts, is that your thoughts are not you. You are not your thoughts. You have no control over the thoughts that you experience, like as much as you don't have any control of seeing certain things in your life. If you walk down the street, you may see a car accident. You may not want to see a car accident. You may not want to see somebody getting injured in that way. There's nothing you can do about that. You saw it. And if sight and all of our senses are essentially the mind's manifestations of things occurring around you, you have no say in what you see or experience. So we have to find a way to separate ourselves from our thoughts, and we do that by saying, you are not your thoughts. The thoughts that you have within your mind, whether positive or negative, they are not you. You should not associate yourself with them. And you're going to need to do that in order to do some shadow work that you're going to have to do in order to improve yourself and basically become more consciously aware of who you are as a human being. Because in order to do shadow work, you have to think about some pretty awful, terrible things. And sometimes these are associated with you as a person, but a lot of times it's just you thinking about things that oftentimes have occurred and have happened to certain people that are horrible and horrifying. But you will shy away from studying that stuff, studying the dark side of the human nature, if you associate with your thoughts, because then you have a thought, and the thought makes you feel bad and terrible and everything, and then you're like, I don't want to have that thought anymore. But if you disassociate yourself from those thoughts, then you can think about everything, and it won't make you feel like you want to not listen to the stuff. It won't make you want to kill yourself, essentially, because man, when you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, you read things, and if you can't separate yourself from what you're experiencing, what you're putting in as thoughts, man, you're paving the way to just some dark times in your life. And if you talk to anyone who's in the meditation stuff, I'm blanking on his name. He's the German sounding guy who does the meditation. Totally blanking on his name. I'll make sure to put it down in the bottom. But it's always the first thing he says. He's like, you are not your thoughts. Like, you have to disassociate yourself with those things. Now, this leads to the question. It's like, well, who are you? We'll talk about that perhaps in the next video. Most people are very disappointed to hear the answer to that question. But the point is here, separate yourself from your thoughts. You are not your thoughts. All that essentially thoughts are is where the origination of a creation begins. So you're experiencing life, and you're going through life, and stuff is happening to you, and you're having more experiences, so you're experiencing more thoughts. And one day you have a thought about something, and that thought makes you go, I want to maybe create that thought. I want to maybe take this perfect idea that's inside my head and show it to somebody else. Well, that's where all creation must begin. You have to have a thought. You need the idea first. And if you don't think about it, if you don't think about a creation, then you cannot create it. So obviously, this is where creation begins. And so, moving on from thoughts, we have to talk about what actually gets us to do things as opposed to just be satisfied with the thought. Because a lot of people have these great ideas, these wondrous ideas, and they don't do anything with them. It's like, well, so there's a disconnection. It appears that thoughts don't actually create a damn thing, and that makes sense because we have thoughts all the time. It doesn't mean that we're creating all the time. It doesn't mean that we're taking action just because we have thoughts. Some people with some of the most deepest, most profound thoughts of all time, they don't put it to pen. They don't write it. They don't speak it. Well, then what's the point? It's a pretty nice thought that you had there, but I can't experience your thoughts. No other human being on the face of the earth can experience your thoughts. So if you had one of the greatest thoughts of all time and you decide not to create that thought for whatever reason, well, you're doing kind of a disservice for everybody else. You took a great idea potentially and hid it away from the rest of the world. Thanks for nothing, buddy. So the point is how do we get this thought, this idea, this creative urge to out into the real world? Well, we have to get inspired. To be inspired means to be aroused by divine influence. This is passions, okay? This is why they call passions art and all that stuff, sculpting and all that. What you're doing is you're thinking of something and you need to create it out there and you need to put it out there. And this is the highest order of consciousness that there is, creation. And we need to be inspired to create. And we're going to break down the term inspire because why not? Well, in as a prefix always means with. In this case, it also means within. Spire actually comes from Greek, from the word pyre. And pyre's a bundle of sticks and stuff that you create this. It's for religious practices, but you're basically creating a fire. So to inspire means you create the fire within, and I can't think of a better word that defines what emotions do for us. They create this religious divine fire within us that forces us to want to create and manifest things in the real world. And we get some thoughts, and then we want to create these thoughts based on our emotion, our drive, our fire within, to actually create these thoughts. And this is important because in order for a thought to manifest itself, it needs energy. This energy is what we call emotion. Emotion is the divine influence that rouses us to take action. Emotion is our fire within because the feeling of emotion is felt within the individual, and the singular goal of our emotion is to get us in motion. That's why it's E-motion, to get us in motion. Emotion is the driving energy behind all of our physical motion, or in other words, emotion gets us to take action in the real world. That's all that emotion is designed to do. In order to get inspired, it needs to allow us to have feelings that other things are experiencing. So for example, if you see a puppy and it's got a little hurt leg and you're like, oh, it's a cute puppy, it's got a little hurt leg, and you just feel this terrible feeling in your body because the puppy is suffering. Well, emotion allows you to have that experience, but the ultimate goal of that emotion is to get you to take action. It's begging you to grab that puppy, pick it up, and get it to a veterinarian. You wouldn't do that without emotion. You wouldn't take that action if you didn't have empathic emotion towards the puppy. That's how all actions occur. It's with emotion, passion. So, emotion is expressed with the nervous system as chemicals that make us feel feelings, okay? So there's an actual biological connection to this. Consciousness is experience, and so we experience feelings just like how we experience from our senses, It's the same system. We're feeling this stuff. We're feeling with our eyes. It's hard to understand, but photons hit our eyes. We're not seeing the photons. We're feeling the photons. And when the photons disappear, we don't feel anything, so our eyes don't do anything, and they go black. So whether the feeling is positive or negative is dependent upon how you decide to interpret the feeling, but whether positive or negative, the emotion, again, only exists to get you to do something. Now, it's easy to separate thought from emotion because you don't feel a thought, whereas you obviously do feel emotion. But even with their clear differences, thought and emotion should be seen as intrinsically connected, and they ought to be acting in accordance with one another. Unification of thought and emotion acts as a checks and balance system. Thoughts need emotion, or need enough emotional energy, in order to manifest themselves on the physical plane. And emotion needs rational thought, rational right reason, to stop our emotions from acting without right reason. So basically, emotion decides which thoughts are acted upon, while thoughts can override irrational emotional urges and impulses. So people, myself included, often beat themselves up over having embarrassing urges. We all have urges that we're not proud of, and they can elicit emotions within us that urge us to act upon them. But it's well within our ability to override these base urges if they aren't acting in accordance with right reason. So, will you give in to your base urges, or will you abstain from them? Isn't this always the same question as always? It's will you do good or will you do evil? In this case, no. I don't want you to think as emotions as this bad thing. It's much more nuanced when it comes to urges, and it ultimately is determined by success. Will this urge that you're having, this emotional urge or impulse, make you more successful? If yes, then pursue that urge or impulse. Will it make you less successful? No? Okay, then let's ignore that one. That's ultimately what we're always talking about here. So, for example, people get a lot of emotional stuff when they want to go talk to a girl, or when a girl wants to go talk to a guy or wants to get a guy to talk to her. And there's a lot of emotion there. There's a lot of energy, a lot of angst. All of that energy, angst, and as they say in the pickup industry, approach anxiety, all of that stuff, all of those emotions are to get you to do that. And in some particular situations, well, in most particular situations, that emotion, again, is just trying to get you to take action. And usually that urge is the correct urge. You should take action. You should talk to that girl. But sometimes, if the girl's in a rush, or if she's working on a nuclear submarine or doing advanced mathematics, maybe you shouldn't approach them there. Maybe you shouldn't give in to those emotional urges in that situation. The only thing that kind of really trips up emotions, which is associated with our conscience, and we'll talk about that very soon, is our culture and society by which we reside within. We can't ignore this fact. Okay? Our emotions are only stymied, really because our emotions are going to tell us the difference between right and wrong, ultimately. Because we feel good when we do good, and we feel bad when we do bad. And so the only time that this gets rubbed the wrong way is when we're in a situation that the culture has created where it's not a good time to give into a base urge. But ultimately, really, we're going to be talking about this. I have huge faith in an emotional state that has a conscious understanding of the objective difference between right and wrong, of morality, of values. And our emotional state is in direct connection and in line with these states. But the point is that ultimately the goal is to align your thoughts with your emotions, which can only be properly done when you consciously know the objective difference between right and wrong, because your emotional impulses are reacting to get you to take action, but not necessarily right action in that particular situation. So, your decision-making processes, rational thought, should depend upon the principles that we are going to discuss later in later videos. But often, just the mere thought of, is this the right thing to do? What should I do? Will this cause harm? Will this make me more successful if I follow through on this action? Just having the thought, having the question, questioning yourself, being aware of the situation around you is more than enough to dissolve unwanted emotional urges that aren't acting in accordance with your success. So, we started this conversation talking about myth and symbolism and symbology. Well, in mysticism, these symbols and myth reign supreme. So I want to talk about one of these symbols. And so in mysticism, there is this thing called the alchemical wedding between Hermes and Aphrodite. And ultimately, Hermes represents logical thought, and Aphrodite represents emotion. And what this wedding is it's a binding of these two thoughts so that they act in accordance with one another. This means that neither one rules the other in any sense of the word. That's not the point of binding things together. These things will act in accordance with, the idea is that these things ought to act in accordance with each other. Thought and emotion, your thoughts and emotions should act in accordance with each other. That'll make your actions, your creations in the real world, your behavior in the real world more successful. So the story, the myth is that their marriage, between Hermes and Aphrodite, creates the hermaphrodite, which is the binding of the two words Hermes and Aphrodite together. And the marriage symbolizes the union of the divine masculine with the divine feminine, which creates the ideal of one who has unified their thoughts and emotions such that there is no contradiction between them. As one thinks, so one feels, and thus so one acts. And this brings us to the third aspect of consciousness, which is the creation or action itself. This is our behavior. Our behavior is controlled by our thoughts and emotions because our emotions get us to take action, and our thoughts are the things that we want to create and are ideas that cause us to have an emotional reaction. So our behavior, again, is completely dependent upon our thoughts and emotions. And there's no reason, this is important, and we're going to talk a lot about this. So there's no reason to try to change your behavior before changing how you think and coming to know your emotional state through knowledge of your conscience and morality, because our behavior is controlled by our thoughts and emotions. So change how you think and understand your emotional state, and then you can change your behavior. And so in order to come to know how you think, you need to come to know how the structure of your you need to know the structure of your thought patterns. The structure of your thought patterns are expressed by your behavior. This is what completes the Trinity. It's really hard to understand our thoughts and emotions just by thinking about them. So, there is a way to overcome this issue. Well, if our behavior is always going to be the result of our thoughts and emotions, if we study our behavior will tell us how we're thinking and how we're feeling. And we do that through reflection, meditation, journaling, and self-observation. You just study yourself and then you'll come to know how you think. Because ultimately, when I'm talking about thought and our emotional state, I'm talking about something much deeper than just your everyday picking your nose, booger, daydream thoughts. We're talking about deep, possibly even traumatic thought patterns that are existing at a subconscious level that are very hard to pick up on. But if you study your behavior for long enough, completing the Trinity, as I said, you can actually come to know what your thought patterns are, and then you can begin, through the process of understanding that you are not your thoughts, to reject some thought patterns that are not making you very successful, and accepting new thought patterns that potentially will make you more successful. And getting those thought patterns to dip below the conscious and into the subconscious, like some kind of submarine heading from air above water to below water. And so ultimately becoming successful is all about coming to know who you are. So observe who you are. And we'll dive much deeper into what I'm talking about here in later videos. So moving on from here, I'm going to show you how truth and consciousness ties together to form the human condition. And we'll do that in the next video with some more metaphor, some more symbolism, some more mysticism, and one of my favorite things to talk about, grammar. And yeah, we'll do that in the next video. And that's it for this one. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out to me. I really do enjoy getting those questions. And then likewise, if you found any of this stuff interesting enough to share, please share it. And I'll talk to you and see you in the next video.